Prejudice contains one of the most cherished love stories in English literature, the courtship between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, surrounded by a much-loved cast of characters who repel, surprise and make us laugh. Today, we begin a week-long Hangout on Air series, which sees us explore the world of Jane Austen, from Elizabeth Bennet, Mr. Darcy, film versions to zombie adaptations. I'd like to welcome Susannah Fullerton, who has been president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia for the past 19 years. A best-selling author, she has just released the must-read Happily Ever After, celebrating Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, which covers everything from the moment Jane Austen receives her first copy of the completed novel to how Pride and Prejudice came to be written, the superb range of comic characters and wicked irony, and why it still tops the favourite book of all-time polls. I'd also like to welcome award-winning actress Miriam Margolyes, who has worked on stage and screen internationally for more than 30 years. She was appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire and yesterday became an Australian citizen. She's well known and loved as Sprout in Harry Potter and many other film projects, and she co-starred in the wonderful Blackadder, where she played the Spanish Infanta Lady Whiteadder and Queen Victoria, and she's currently appearing in the Australian production of Miss Fisher's Murder series with armed students and the ABC. She most recently toured Australia with Dickens Women, where she played an impressive 23 different characters based on the novels of Charles Dickens, and it's one of the most incredible productions I've seen. So on to Pride and Prejudice. Today we'll be talking about the charming heroine of the novel, Miss Elizabeth Bennet.
This is chapter 19 of Pride. The next day opened a new scene at Longbourn. Mr. Collins made his declaration in form. Having resolved to do it without loss of time, as his leave of absence extended only to the following Saturday, and having no feelings of diffidence to make it distressing to himself even at that moment, he set about it in a very orderly manner, with all the observances which he supposed a regular part of the business. On finding Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, and one of the younger girls together soon after breakfast, he addressed the mother in these words.
May I hope, madam, for your interest with your fair daughter Elizabeth, whom I solicit for the honour of a private audience with her in the course of this morning?
Before Elizabeth had time for anything but a blush of surprise, Mrs. Bennet instantly answered, "Oh dear, yes, certainly. I'm sure Lizzie will be very happy. I'm sure she can have no objection. Come, Kitty, I want you upstairs." And gathering her work together, she was hastening away when Elizabeth called out, "Dear Ma'am, do not go. I beg you will not go. Mr. Collins must excuse me. He can have nothing to say to me that anybody need not hear. I am going away myself." "No, no, nonsense, Lizzie. I desire you will stay where you are." And upon Elizabeth seeming really with vexed and embarrassed looks about to escape, she added, "Lizzie, I insist upon your staying and hearing Mr. Collins." Elizabeth would not oppose such an injunction, and a moment's consideration making her also sensible that it would be wisest to get it over as soon and as quietly as possible, she sat down again and tried to conceal by incessant employment the feelings which were divided between distress and diversion. Mrs. Bennet and Kitty walked off, and as soon as they were gone, Mr. Collins began.
"Believe me, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that your modesty, so far from doing you any disservice, rather adds to your other perfections. You would have been less amiable in my eyes had there not been this little unwillingness. But allow me to assure you that I have your respected mother's permission for this address. You can hardly doubt the purport of my discourse, however your natural delicacy may lead you to dissemble. My attentions have been too marked to be mistaken. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life. But before I am run away with by my feelings on this subject, perhaps it will be advisable for me to state my reasons for marrying, and moreover for coming into Hertfordshire with the design of selecting a wife, as I certainly did. The idea of Mr. Collins, with all his solemn composure, being run away with by his feelings, made Elizabeth so near laughing that she could not use the short pause he allowed in any attempt to stop him farther, and he continued. My reasons for marrying are, first, that I think it a right thing for every clergyman in easy circumstances, like myself, to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced it will add very greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I ought to have mentioned earlier, that it is the particular advice and recommendation of the very noble lady whom I have the honour of calling patroness. Twice has she condescended to give me her opinion, unasked too, on this subject, and it was but the very Saturday night before I left Hunsford, between our pools at quadrille, while Mrs. Jenkins was arranging Mr. Berg's footstool, that she said, Mr. Collins, you must marry. A clergyman like you must marry. Choose properly. Choose a gentlewoman for my sake. And for your own, let her be an active, useful sort of person, not brought up high, but able to make a small income go a good way. This is my advice. Find such a woman as soon as you can, bring her to Hunsford, and I will visit her. Allow me, by the way, to observe, my fair cousin, that I do not reckon the notice and kindness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh as among the least of the advantages in my power to offer. You will find her manners beyond anything I can describe, and your wit and vivacity, I think, must be acceptable to her, especially when tempered with the silence and respect with which her rank will inevitably excite. Thus much for my general intention in favour of matrimony. It remains to be told why my views were directed to Longbourn instead of my own neighbourhood, where I assure you there are many amiable young women. But the fact is that being as I am to inherit this estate after the death of your honoured father, who, however, may live many years longer, I could not satisfy myself without resolving to choose a wife from among his daughters, that the loss to them might be as little as possible when the melancholy event takes place, which, however, as I have already said, it may not be for several years. This has been my motive, my fair cousin, and I flatter myself it will not sink me in your esteem. And now, nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affection. To fortune I am perfectly indifferent, and shall make no demand of that nature on your father, since I am well aware that it could not be complied with, and that £1,000 in the 4%, which will not be yours till after your mother's decease, is that all you may ever be entitled to. On that head, however, therefore, you shall be uniformly silent, and you may assure yourself that no ungenerous reproach shall ever pass my lips when we are married. It was absolutely necessary to interrupt him now. You are too hasty, sir, she cried. You forget that I have made no answer. Let me do it without farther loss of time. Accept my thanks for the compliment you're paying me. I am very sensible of the honour of your proposals, but it is impossible for me to do otherwise than decline them. I am not now to learn, replied Mr. Collins, with a formal wave of the hand, that it is usual with young ladies to reject the addresses of the man whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favour, and that sometimes the refusal is repeated a second or even a third time. I am therefore by no means discouraged by what you've just said, and shall hope to lead you to the altar ere long. Upon my word, sir, cried Elizabeth, your hope is rather an extraordinary one after my declaration. I do assure you that I am not one of those young ladies, if such young ladies there are,
who are so daring as to risk their happiness on the chance of being asked a second time. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who would make you so. Nay, were your friend Lady Catherine to know me, I am persuaded she would find me in every respect ill qualified for the situation.
Were it certain that Lady Catherine would think so,
said Mr. Collins very gravely,
but I cannot imagine that her ladyship would at all disapprove of you. And you may be certain that when I have the honour of seeing her again, I shall speak in the highest terms of your modesty, economy, and other amiable qualifications.
Indeed, Mr. Collins, all praise of me will be unnecessary. You must give me leave to judge for myself, and pay me the compliment of believing what I say. I wish you very happy and very rich, and by refusing your hand, do all in my power to prevent your being otherwise. In making me the offer, you must have satisfied the delicacy of your feelings with regard to my family, and may take possession of Longbourn estate whenever it falls without any self-reproach. This matter may be considered, therefore, as finally settled. And rising as she thus spoke, she would have quitted the room, had not Mr. Collins thus addressed her.
When I do myself the honour of speaking to you next on this subject, I shall hope to receive a more favourable answer than you have now given me, though I am far from accusing you of cruelty at present, because I know it to be the established custom of your sex to reject a man on the first application. And perhaps you would have even said now as much to encourage my suit as would be consistent with the true delicacy of the female character.
Really, Mr. Collins, cried Elizabeth with some warmth, you puzzle me exceedingly. If what I have said hitherto can appear to you in the form of encouragement, I know not how to express my refusal in such a way as may convince you of its being one.
You must give me leave to flatter myself, my dear cousin, that your refusal of my addresses is merely words, of course. My reasons for believing it are briefly these. It does not appear to me that my hand is unworthy your acceptance, or that the establishment I can offer would be any other than highly desirable. My situation in life, my connections with the family of de Bourgh, and my relationship to your own are circumstances highly in my favour, and you should take it into farther consideration that in spite of your manifold attractions, it is by no means certain that another offer of marriage may ever be made you. Your portion is unhappily so small that it will in all likelihood undo the effects of your loveliness and amiable qualifications. As I must therefore conclude that you are not serious in your rejection of me, I shall choose to attribute it to your wish of increasing my love by suspense, according to the usual practice of elegant females.
I do assure you, sir, that I have no pretension whatever to that kind of elegance which consists in tormenting a respectable man. I would rather be paid the compliment of being believed sincere. I thank you again and again for the honour you have done me in your proposals, but to accept them is absolutely impossible. My feelings in every respect forbid it. Can I speak plainer? Do not consider me now as an elegant female attending to plague you, but as a rational creature speaking the truth from her heart.
You are uniformly charming, cried he, with an air of awkward gallantry, and I am persuaded that when sanctioned by the express authority of both your excellent parents, my proposals will not fail of being acceptable.
To such perseverance in wilful self-deception, Elizabeth would make no reply, and immediately and in silence withdrew, determined that if he persisted in considering her repeated refusals as flattering encouragement, to apply to her father whose negative might be uttered in such a manner as must be decisive, and whose behaviour at least could not be mistaken for the affectation and coquetry of an elegant female.
That was absolutely
That is the end of chapter 9.
Thank you, Miriam, and certainly a wonderful chapter to show us the passion of Elizabeth Bennet. Susannah, Jane creates such incredibly contrasting women in this novel, but our heroine Elizabeth stands alone. What makes her so unique in this work, and why does she invoke such passionate debate?
Well, Elizabeth Bennet provoked great debate when the novel was first published because she was so forthright, so physically energetic. It's very interesting to note that Elizabeth Bennet's very first words in this novel are to contradict her mother. And in the early 19th century, young ladies were supposed to be quiet and modest and correct, and of course very obedient to their parents. So Elizabeth Bennet starts off by a contradiction. We know from the very first time she opens her mouth that she is going to be a heroine who is very different, very unusual. And so, as I said, some of the contemporary readers of the day really rather disapproved of Elizabeth. But modern women love Elizabeth Bennet. We love her energy, her forthrightness, her independence of spirit. I think for me, the quality that Elizabeth Bennet has that really puts her ahead of anybody else is the quality of charm, and that's something that's very hard to get in a novel. It's very easy for a novelist to say my heroine is charming, but to actually see that charm at work, to see Elizabeth Bennet charming the other characters and charming the reader every single time she speaks, is a really remarkable achievement. And I think it's Elizabeth's charm that makes her stand out so much as such an incredibly memorable heroine. What do the others think? Can any of you think of other charming heroines that can even begin to compete with Elizabeth Bennet?
Well, Susannah, I know you would prefer Emma to be the charming heroine. I'm not sure. I don't know that she has quite the same level of charm. I mean, you believe she's a greater heroine than Lizzie Bennet is, just because she changes so much. But certainly initially she doesn't have, I think, the same charm, the same universal charm for everybody.
I totally agree with Diane.
It's my favourite book.
Emma's not as charming as Elizabeth.
No, yet she has more advantages. She's, she comes from a richer family. You could argue she's brought up. She's certainly probably less impetuous, but she just, I think there's that degree of sort of blithe arrogance of just steamrolling over the top of everybody else that makes her a little bit less than ideal company from time to time. So.
She's not quite as lovable as Elizabeth Bennet. She's naughtier. Emma is more badly behaved, but Elizabeth also, I think, in this novel, like Emma, has a lot to learn. Do you all agree? She's not a faultless heroine at the start of the novel or even at the end. I think Emma has a great deal to learn in the course of the novel, and that's one of the reasons why we love her. We see her learning and becoming a better human being. Joanna, do you feel that?
We're just having trouble with your audio, Joanna.
We've lost Joanna's voice.
I was going to say that the great thing about Elizabeth is you tend to discover as she learns, and you discover more about the other characters and the story, and it's almost like we need her to start discovering and making those mistakes for us to be able to discover the wonderful story that sits behind Pride and Prejudice.
There's a fabulous moment that comes exactly halfway through Pride and Prejudice, and Elizabeth is reading Mr. Darcy's letter, and she puts the letter down and she thinks about the accusations that she has made against him and all the things that have gone wrong between them. And she says to herself, "Until this moment, I never knew myself." And it's a very powerful moment in Pride and Prejudice, and she learns so much about herself. And of course, from that time on, she starts to mend some of her faults and become a more tolerant and a less prejudiced person.
Hello, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, I was going to say I think Elizabeth actually has a great deal to learn, because she almost makes a terrible mistake. She could have missed out on Mr. Darcy, like many, many young girls, perhaps even all of us. She falls for a heartless charmer, Wickham, rather like Marianne does, but Wickham doesn't have the charm of Willoughby, I think. But Elizabeth actually is quite ready to fall in love with Wickham, and she really has to learn self-knowledge, I feel. And I think that's part of her appeal, for ongoing appeal. What do you think?
I agree too, Joanna, but I wanted to link in with the comment about that Susannah made about her being charming. And what I'm interested in is that charming can be regarded as a very modern, well, not so much used in modern day. You don't always say that she's a charming girl. But what I'm interested in is how Susannah's saying that Elizabeth is charming, which she absolutely is. She transcends to modern young women so well. Letitia, you may have a comment about that as perhaps being the youngest in our midst, that even though charming is not something we use so much today, whether, you know, what is it the appeal to young women today?
Yeah, I think I can't say I speak for all young women everywhere, but yeah, I think charming is an interesting word, because in our day and age today, it can almost be a negative thing. If you're too charming, it's almost like you're slightly manipulative. So what I love about Elizabeth is she doesn't have that edge to her character, that she comes across as very genuine, and even when she's in the wrong, you know that she spoke from the heart, or you know, each and every time, and she spoke from passion, and that sort of makes us forgive her, because in some form or another she was always genuine.
I think also we really love Elizabeth because she's so loyal and loving herself. Look at the way she cares for her sister Jane when Jane is sick. Look at her wonderfully close relationship with her father. She's even incredibly tolerant with her dire mother. She copes with Mrs. Bennet without being rude to her and telling Mrs. Bennet to get lost, mum, as many a modern girl would probably do today. So we love Elizabeth for those really good qualities that she has, while at the same time rejoicing that she does learn new things about herself and about other people in the course of the novel.
I think that's humour as well, because you can't help but enjoy her sense of humour and enjoy her comments and feel along with them. So part of the charm, I think, is, yes, she's genuine, yes, you can see how she feels about her family, but she's also quite funny and quite sharp and, you know, as you said before, just a little bit naughty. So you kind of do like her because you're laughing along with her at the same time at the Caroline Bingleys and the Mrs. Hursts as well. So you kind of excited her, I think.
There's a really gorgeous moment when Elizabeth is visiting at Netherfield, and she's out walking and encounters Mr. Darcy walking with the Bingley sister on either arm. And she makes a comment about the picturesque. Now, one of the things to do with the picturesque in that day and age was that a painter producing a truly picturesque work of art was supposed to have in the picture one bull and two cows. They were considered essential elements of the picturesque. So when Lizzie says to the ladies and Mr. Darcy, "Oh no, please don't move, the picturesque would be quite spoiled if you did," he's basically telling Mr. Bingley that he's a bull and he has a cow on either arm. It's a lovely, clever moment where she gets her own back at those dreadful Bingley sisters.
I think that's partly what charms Darcy too, that he loves her ready wit and the way that she is prepared to be outspoken. And going back to what you said before, Susannah, that she's such a kind person as well. She looks after Jane and so on. He's like that too. We hear that later on from Mrs. Reynolds, that he looks after the people who depend on him. So all the time, I think this is what goes towards him falling in love with her, don't you think?
Very much so. I think he's been so over-flattered by so many people that he notices her because she doesn't flatter. But then, of course, he very quickly sees her good qualities when it comes to nursing Jane and helping her family. So I think that's a very good point, Joanna.
There's the physical aspect too. I mean, you know, it got picked up in the 1995 BBC version a fair bit about the, you know, she's jumping over stiles and schlepping through mud and, you know, lots of rosy cheeks and, you know,
Even bosoms.
that's right, lots of bosoms.
Heaving bosom.
Well, she's not this sort of, you know, she's not Lady Bertram wilting on the sofa patting a pug all day. So she's out and about, she's doing stuff, and I think that's probably attractive for him as well.
So you actually think it's more than a pair of fine eyes that gets him in?
That's right.
Well, from the BBC production, the heaving bosom is very much up front. Yes.
I think it's also very interesting to see Elizabeth in relation to her friend Charlotte Lucas, who of course becomes Charlotte Collins. Poor Charlotte doesn't have Elizabeth's charm and beauty and wit. She's 27, 28, which was regarded as being rather on the shelf. And in the end, she accepts the dreadful Mr. Collins rather than remain an unmarried woman dependent on her father and later on her brothers. And there's a wonderful moment when Charlotte comes to tell Elizabeth that she's going to marry Mr. Collins. And Elizabeth just speaks out before stopping to think and says, "Marry Mr. Collins? Impossible!" And poor Charlotte has to explain that no, it's not impossible. It's actually what's going to happen. And Elizabeth, like so many of us, she's put her foot in it. She's said something without thinking it through first. And she has to try and apologize. But sadly, that marriage does, of course, change her relationship with her friend. She can never quite feel the same about her friend Charlotte after Charlotte marries Mr. Collins. But I think Charlotte is in there as a sort of commentary on single women of that era. Jane Austen showing that there were women like Charlotte who had to take on dreadful men such as Mr. Collins in order to have the financial security of marriage.
On paper, though, Mr. Collins does actually read well. I mean, it's not until you meet him and hear him that you realise, you know, what a complete dork he is. But on paper, he's actually a good prospect. So
it's true, he is.
Miriam, with your reading that you just did, we got a great glimpse of what Mr. Collins is like, and I guess speaking his words and reading out loud what he was like. Do you think Elizabeth was right in rejecting him so passionately when she had no other prospects?
Oh, without question. Without question, she was quite right. And I think he's really one of the most loathed and despised men in literature. I wanted to ask Susannah how the public have received Pride and Prejudice in the 200 years since it was first published.
Well, when the novel first came out, it was not a bestseller. It attracted a small amount of interest. The first edition sold out in a reasonable amount of time, and it went into a second edition, and after that a third. But it even fell out of print for a very short time. There was a period when Pride and Prejudice was not in print. People talked about it at dinner parties. The great actor and theatre manager Richard Brinsley Sheridan spent an entire dinner party raving about this novel to the woman sitting next to him and saying, "You must read it. This is the most marvellous, funny novel that I have ever read." So there were admirers, but it was not a runaway bestseller. Sir Walter Scott was being paid as much as £1,000 per novel when Jane Austen was writing her books. She got £10 for Northanger Abbey, and she only made about £260 in her lifetime. So she wasn't getting a lot of money for any of her novels. And then in the Victorian age, a man called Mr. Dickens came along, and he, of course, was the great bestseller of that era, and everyone adored Dickens, and he was far more popular than Jane Austen. But towards the end of the 19th century, one of Jane Austen's nephews wrote a memoir about his aunt, and that book began a little trickle of books about Jane Austen. People became curious as to who she was and what her books were all about. Critical works began to appear, and now more and more and more books are coming out all the time about Jane Austen. And it has been said that Jane Austen is the third most written about woman of all time, which is really quite amazing. Number one is Joan of Arc, and number two is the Virgin Mary. And those two women have had the Catholic Church help them every step of the way. Jane Austen has got to position number three, all by her very clever self. So I think she has done amazingly well. But it has been a 200-year journey for her to get to that point.
Susannah, why did it get so accepted at the time? Do you think it was this challenging heroine that existed in the book?
Well, when the novel had been first written, when Jane Austen was a young woman of about 20, her father wrote to a London publisher offering the novel for publication. He didn't actually send the manuscript, so the publisher never got to read it. And Mr. Austen wrote this terribly boring letter saying, I have in my possession this 3-volume novel and you might like to publish it. And really, it would have been surprising if the publisher had taken up that offer without even seeing the manuscript. And he just replied by return of post and said, no, I'm not interested. So Jane Austen put the manuscript away, and of course it was only when she had reworked it, and we don't know how much because the original manuscript does not survive, and then of course got it published in 1813. I don't even want to imagine a world that doesn't have Pride and Prejudice in it. I think it would be a very sad place to live. Don't you all think so?
Indeed. Yes.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, I really want to thank everybody
That
so
was
much.
very
Oh, sorry. Go on, Miriam.
No, I was very interested in what Susannah had to say, because I think that the standing of Jane Austen in a way has never been higher than it is today. I know in America the Jane Austen Society is fantastically active and numerous, and they have a big conference every year, as you do in Australia, and the same in England. So she's really one of the most famous women in the world, certainly. And it's lovely to think that 200 years after this wonderful book first came out.
It is great cause for celebration, isn't it?
And today, of course, is the day. Today is the actual 200th anniversary. So it's really wonderful to be gathering here and talking about the wonderful Jane Austen and her amazing novel, Pride and Prejudice. I want to thank everybody so much for coming along today. We have 4 more wonderful nights talking about Pride and Prejudice this week. So I hope that you can all join us again. Susannah, thank you so much for leading our discussions today, and we look forward to talking about our rather sexy hero, Mr. Darcy, tomorrow. And Miriam, of course, we're going to enjoy another wonderful reading from you tomorrow, and you'll be joining us the rest of the week as well, which is very exciting. And I want to thank everybody else who's been on this Hangout and who's been watching along with us today, and we hope to see you again tomorrow. Thank you so much.